This is 7 Biblical Readings for a Post-October 7th World, a podcast miniseries brought to you by the Matan Women's Institute for Torah Studies. This entire series is dedicated in memory of the heroes our nation has lost in the past year and a half, and in prayer for the return of our remaining hostages. Welcome back to our special series, 7 Biblical Readings for a Post-October 7th World. Each week, one of the Jewish world's most erudite and wisdom-seeking Torah scholars is rereading an iconic biblical text in light of the changing Israeli, Jewish, and world realities since October 7th. Ideas that they have felt changing within them in the past year and a half and around them. While there has been unfathomable loss and atrocity, we will emerge from this stronger if we're able to elucidate for ourselves and to the world what it is that we have learned from these challenges. Today I'm sitting with Dr. Yael Ziegler, a senior lecturer at Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study and senior Tanakh lecturer at Herzog College, and the author of Ruth from Alienation to Monarchy, Promises to Keep the Oath of Biblical Narrative, and Lamentations, Faith in a Turbulent World. Dr. Ziegler lectures widely in synagogues and on campuses and has served as scholar in residence on 5 continents. Yael, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Yosefa. Nice to be here.
Our conversation today is going to surround battle stories in the book of Samuel, and we'll explore together heroism, leadership in battle, and the challenges of battle for those who wage it. I know that the book of Shmuel, the book of Samuel, is a book that it's one of your favorites, right?
It's definitely one of them that I teach very, very frequently. And it's a favorite in that its stories are so vibrant. I would say one more thing, which is that its stories are stories that we can relate to today, more than at many periods in Jewish history, because it's about the setting up of a society, and it's about leadership, and it's about, unfortunately, battles, which is also something that we've certainly really experienced in the past year and a half.
So we're going to open with our first story, looking at the 14th chapter of the first book of Samuel, of Shmuel Aleph. And why don't you bring us into that story?
Okay, well, I'll begin by saying that this, I think, is the story of tremendous heroism, right? We have this figure, the son of the king, the son of Saul, the son of Shaul, Yonatan, also known as Jonathan. I'll call him Yonatan. Yonatan sees, as does Shaul, as do all of Am Yisrael, all of the nation of Israel, they see this tremendous enemy. And the enemy is spread out, kachol asher asfat hayam larov, which is a description of like the sand on the beach, right? There are so many of them. And, Shaul, naturally, I think he's quite afraid, right? And he's afraid of going into battle. And Yonatan is not. Right? Yonatan picks himself up with his weapons bearer and he plunges into battle. And his heroism is really driven by faith in God. But faith in God that is, I think there's a faith in God that is also mitigated by his knowledge that he doesn't control God. And his words are there's so much to learn from his words. He says to his weapons bearer, let's go, right? Just you and I will cross over to the enemy battlefield. Right? And then he says, Ulai ya'aseh Hashem lanu. Maybe God will do this for us. Ki ein Hashem ma'atzor lahoshia birav o bima'at. Because God has no trouble saving, with a few people or with many people. It's not the amount of people that go into battle that determine success of the battle. It's God. And so I think that Yonatan's his sense of confidence in God, but also his modesty before God, his humility before assuming that he knows what God is going to do, both of those pieces are it makes it really, I think, one of the most remarkable battle moments in all of Tanakh.
The word ulai is also a very powerful word because I think that it really underscores the sense of being open to the realm of possibility, right? Very often we look at reality in front of us and maybe we're overconfident in what we think will happen, or, I've seen that already. Nothing new can faze me. And I think that this ulai kind of can become a catchphrase for an attitude in life of anything can happen. And anything can happen can be a scary thing. Like, oh no, anything can happen and I can be paralyzed in fear. But in this case, it's the exact opposite, meaning maybe God will help us. This is looks like an insane battle. It looks like, and describing enemy armies as kachol el sfat hayam is something that repeats in a number of places in Tanakh, and it never bodes well in our biblical stories. But he's saying, you never know. Like, if I don't leave open the realm of possibility, then I don't leave any space for God in reality.
Yeah, it's about striking this very delicate balance between faith in God and also a very healthy sense of we don't know, not becoming arrogant, not feeling that, we can determine the outcome by our actions, because that's a tremendous mistake. And we've seen both of these things, in our current reality.
It's also even more remarkable because with all the adrenaline that is pumping through those who need to put themselves, to almost convince themselves to have enough confidence to go in this moment, to be able at the same moment to hold open this space is unbelievable. I wouldn't call bifurcation, but like a synthesis in the soul of him speaking. Like, if I just translate a little bit to myself what you're saying, it's the ability to hold those two spaces, to have fortitude and confidence to go forward and risk your life, but also to say, who knows what it'll be.
The wisdom to be able to also be a little restrained. Yeah. There is something, look, soldiers tend to be young, right? And part of that is because we do want soldiers who have the ability to move forward into battle without fear, but a healthy dose of fear and apprehension and the knowledge that we don't always, that we can't control every situation. That certainly is part of the story. The other piece about this story is the way that his weapons bearer responds to him, right? So, Vayomer lo noseh chelav, his weapons bearer says to him, Asay kol asher bilvavecha, do everything that is in your heart. Netelach hineni imcha kilvavcha, right? Kilvavecha. I am with you like your heart. And to me, that's a moment where we see that Yonatan has inspired through this really delicate balance and this of wisdom, but also courage. He's inspired. He's a great leader. He's inspired his weapons bearer to do something which is quite ludicrous from a military standpoint, and to go with him and to accompany him because he trusts him, and that is a real lesson in leadership, certainly military leadership, but I would say in leadership in general.
Yeah, to also that camaraderie which sits at the base of the loyalty that people feel towards each other in these moments.
That's right.
Yeah.
I remember thinking about this story a lot right after October 7th. And I remember that week was a very difficult week, but it was also a week just of trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah, it was disorienting.
It was very disorienting. We're putting pieces together, and at the same time, of course, I had 4 sons that were out, called up to Miluim on every border, and so trying to deal with both the emotions of that, and at the same time trying to piece things together. And what began to emerge from the different stories that we were hearing of October 7th and the days afterwards were stories of tremendous heroism. Heroism that was built on commitment to saving strangers, to doing tremendous acts of courage in the face of enemy fire and the unknown. And I remember one of the stories that many of us were hearing about in those first days was the story of Elchanan Kamansan, the son of Rav Benny Kamansan, who is the Rosh Yeshiva of Otniel, where 2 of my sons learned. And he, on the day of October 7th, he himself, of course, didn't really know what was happening. He took his brother, and they each took their personal weapons, and they drove down to Be'eri. And they went
with their nephew.
Their nephew eventually joined them, and they I think they commandeered an army jeep, and they just went in and out of Be'eri 9 or 10 times, saving people. To this day, they don't know how many people they saved. I remember afterwards, someone said the words to me, it's an act of biblical-like heroism, right? Proportions of that are biblical-like. I remember at the time thinking about this story, and that there's something about it that seemed even more than biblical acts of heroism. And maybe what it was is that Yonatan, because he is a biblical figure, he's somewhat separated from us. And we sort of have expectations that that's what our biblical heroes are going to do. That's why they're biblical heroes. That's why there are chapters of the Bible written about them. And suddenly to see those same kinds of stories of courage, stories of faith, stories of commitment, emerge from the regular people amongst us, and to know that they are our heroes on the level of our biblical heroes, that was a remarkable revelation. And again, I think some of it was a revelation to those people who were doing it. Until
that moment pulls it out of you, you don't necessarily know that you have it inside of you.
Yeah, and that's just one story of hundreds of stories, many of which I don't think we'll ever know. Stories of people at the Nova Party, young kids who were just there to dance, but ended up risking their lives and sometimes even losing their lives to save each other. And these kinds of stories, they take us back to the Tanakh because they show us stories of people who rise to become the best them that they could be in situations of great challenge.
There's a paragraph that Rav Kook writes in the collection that we generally call Orot HaMilchama, even though he didn't collect it in that kind of, that was done by his son. But he makes this comment and says that when we look at the biblical generations, sometimes if we think about them for a moment, there seems a certain incongruousness between the fact that many of them were mainly dealing with battles and war, and the fact that we often look at them in a religious worldview, that these were sort of our greatest figures, and that we might look at that and say, well, how do those two work together? I think, by the way, that this is a question that really emerges also from 2,000 years of exile, where we don't see this kind of molding in front of us, where you can have people who are doing both. But what he says relates, I think, exactly to what you were saying. That he says that when these people are fighting a war, an existential war, a war for the very existence that they want to continue, he says that it does something very, very deep to them. And he says it brings out koach hachayim, hachatuv v'hagavush, ha'etan v'hamutzak. It brings out this vitality. And if I could translate his really transcendent words, it brings out this power of life that is shaped, that is strong, that is sort of almost impermeable, sheshachan b'kirbam, that was sort of lying dormant inside of them. And he says that umitoch chukazo, from this power, kocheno that it's specifically through this, I would say, in war, this translucence, this ability to say, this is what I have to do, and that clarity that comes with that moment of this is what I have to do, that Rav Kook says reflects back on the spiritual self, meaning it brings out this tremendous vitality that wouldn't have been there. So don't think, how could these pieces work together? But specifically because they're there fighting for their existence, it actually elevates their entire being. Now, it's a slightly more spiritual spin on that piece. But as we said, many people, I think, wouldn't have thought in themselves that they had these capabilities or these little moments of heroism that only once they get retold later they probably don't even think about themselves that a lot of this was heroic. We both know someone who was injured very badly, thankfully on the way to recovery, and he wasn't supposed to be where he was, but the other reservist next to him, he said to him, "You're a parent. I'm not married yet. Let me go first." And in fact, he was injured and the other was not. So there are all these little pieces that they don't necessarily look like heroism in the moment itself. And then afterward, it ends up being something very different. So I think that there are these dormant powers inside of people that they get pulled out. And we ask ourselves these questions, what would we do in situation X? And we can plan a little bit, but there's a part of me that also believes that when we're in a situation, unfortunately, of life and death, we're able, right, the adrenaline along with these powers we have inside of us emerge.
When we look ahead at some of the other Bible war stories in the book of Samuel, so obviously the most the event that reminds us most of Yonatan's battle is David's battle with Goliath, right? And that's in the 17th chapter in the first book of Samuel. And there I think we really do see the kind of courage that that Yonatan and David share, which I think really leads to also this deep respect and profound love that I think characterizes their relationship and their desire to work together to pull out each other's
best selves.
Yeah, their best selves. And we really see that they're pretty much parallel figures. But I actually want to turn our attention to a different battle that David battles, and that is the battle with Amalek in Shmuel Aleph Perek Lamed. And here I think this is the 30th chapter of the first book of Samuel. And here I think we really see, we see something different about David, and definitely we see here the best of David, the best of his leadership, the best of his courage, the best of his faith, the best of his ability to work with his people's weaknesses and challenges in war. And I'll show you a little bit of what I mean by that. I mean, the story opens with David has been away with all of his men have gone up to battle in the northern part of the country on the Gilboa, right? And they come back from that battle. They didn't fight there, but that's for a different reason. And when they come back to their city, to the city of Tziklag, which they have left pretty vulnerable because all of the battle age men went up to, went a 3 days journey away. So when they come back, they find that their city has been raided, right? The city has been raided, destroyed, and the women and children have been taken captive. And this, one doesn't have to go very far to feel how deeply this story must have affected David and his men, because it certainly is something that we're all thinking about all the time. The Chatufim, those who have been taken hostage in Gaza are always on our minds. And so this story, I think, really just kind of, we see the emotions that play out here in, almost in this really magnified way. So there's no way not to think about this particular battle in terms of what we're going through. But what we see here in Pasuk Daled is that David and the people, they lift up their voice and they cry, Ad asher ein bahem koach livkot, right? Until they have no strength left. It's just such a powerful description of collapse, of total emotional collapse. What do? And the next piece is that the people want to stone David. There is an immediate instinct to blame. Now, the pasuk in between, the verse in between, tells us that David has personal stake in this. That his
he's
wives
also
are taken
suffering.
also.
It's not that he doesn't suffer. He suffers because his wives are also taken.
His wives are taken, and his men's wives and children are taken, and yet they need someone to blame. Right? It sort of seems very sort of psychologically astute. But also the pasuk tells us, why do they want to stone him? Ki mara nefesh kol ha'am. Because they were bitter. They couldn't see things rationally, right? They just needed to lash out. And the last piece of this, which I think is just so extraordinary, is the end of verse 6, which is Vayitchazek David b'Hashem Elokav. Where does David find strength? He finds strength in God. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't say that he prays. It doesn't say that he prostrates himself on the ground. It doesn't actually explain what he does. I kind of envision him just sort of tucking away inward, like finding his inner strength to be able to deal with this, because he's standing in front of a mob of angry and terribly, terribly sad and bittered and anguished people. And he is drawing on this inner strength. And so that's the first piece of the story, which I think is, extraordinary in its own right.
I mean, he's drawing on his belief in God, meaning it's not only him. He has no other humans to rely on.
That's right.
So the only thing he has is himself and his belief in God. So I think that it's his personal belief that he's pulling up from inside of himself. And he's of course also utilizing his character strength, but he's really pulling on that piece of emunah and of that belief. And I think that that's also something that's, if I can just immediately connect it to our reality also in the last year and a half, is that obviously we have, the people fighting and putting their lives in line for this country, people are there for all different kinds of reasons. Meaning no one's asking them the reasons. They're there because they're obligated to, but everyone's there from a different heart space. And there are soldiers who are there because of a deep belief in their nationalism. And there are soldiers who are there without deep belief because that's just what they're doing because they're a citizen of the country. And there are also, soldiers and families who are out there and supporting those out there who are functioning from a space of belief in God or in the divine process that they believe that they're part of.
I think also it's not just belief in God, it's faith that this will come out the way that God intended for it to come out. That there's something here that enables him to move forward and not to lose himself in despair, which is it's so easy to lose oneself in despair because we see right now what is going on around us. And in other words, we don't exactly know what this means here. Vayitchazek David b'Hashem Elokav. David was strengthened by God, but I do think maybe it's a little bit what you were starting to say, which is maybe you want to say it, that it's patience. It's the ability to see the bigger picture.
I think that there's a piece here. I mean, he doesn't say Vayamin David. It doesn't say he believed in God. So whatever, there's like a partnership being drawn here between David's inner strength because of his belief. And you know what, Yael? I don't, with no apologetics needed, there are a lot of people who are drawing a tremendous amount of strength from their belief that we're part of a longer process, that we're here because we're supposed to be here. And while sometimes beliefs can lead us in places that maybe we don't want to go to, it also can provide a great amount of fortitude and patience and strength for people in times that are difficult, right? Faith does carry people through very, very hard moments. And there's a lot of people, specifically in this country, who have a whole host of different kinds of faiths about the moment we're in. But I think that there are those whose faiths are strengthening them, and there are those whose faiths are actually bringing them to feel very weak vis-a-vis Israel at this moment. And they lead to very different end results.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I think we have here what gives David the ability to go on in the face of despair. But the next piece that I think that I want to talk about in this parak, which I think it's an extraordinary piece, is that he takes his men. First, he asks God, and then he says, okay, we're going to go find these raiders who destroyed our city, and more importantly, took our women and children captives, which is, really an extraordinary thing to do, because we're talking about going to find a needle in a haystack, right? Where are they going? How are they going to even search? And so he enlists God, right? He asks God, should I go? Will I find them? And God says yes, right? He does this, of course, through the means of the ephod, right?
Some sort of oracle.
Yeah. And he goes to find these raiders. Now, two really important things happen here that I think are extraordinary. The first is that some of his men become very exhausted, right?
A theme in battle stories.
Yeah. And they can't go on. I mean, they have been on a 3-day journey back from the Gilboa, and they've been exhausted by crying, and they're not able to go on, right? And so he leaves them behind. Okay, so leave that aside for a moment, because we'll come back to that point, right? That point is going to be a very important point later. Yeah. But then the other thing that happens is that he finds this young man lying at the side of the road. Now, David just sees a young sick man, and he takes him and he gives him food and he gives him water and he revives him. And it takes him a while to revive him, right? If you look at the description, first he gives him lechem, then he gives him water, then he gives him, a fig cake, a pelech dveila, then he gives him these grapes, and then he eats, and finally he comes back to life again. So it's a real investment of time and energy and food. Now, David has no idea who this guy is.
And it's an Ish Mitzri.
Well, he doesn't know yet.
Okay. It says, we're told that it's an Egyptian man. So we're finding ourselves fulfilling our mission that we left Egypt with, which is to be kind to those on the outside or those who are not in their space. So he's almost fulfilling here the 48 times commandment of to be kind to the ger and to those who are weak.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would, obviously you can always take a cynical viewpoint that he thought that this guy might have information on where his captives are. But
there's no hint of that in the text.
Yeah, there's no hint of that at all in the text. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems as though David stops the they're on this mission,
Yeah.
and they stop and they say, wait, somebody needs food and water. And that's also, it's keeping your humanity
Yeah.
within the context of battle.
Also, they're on a raid. Like, time is of the essence.
That's right.
So you're like, maybe this shouldn't be. But yes, there's something,
That's
I would say there's something, it doesn't have to be maternal, but meaning it's
humane.
Yes.
It's humane. It's not losing our humanity. And we're going to see it afterwards also. I think the Tanakh is very aware that battle can easily lend itself to us losing our humanity. And so that's why there's so much detail here, right? There's so much food that he gives him, and it takes him so long, but he keeps every human life is valuable. And at this point, once he comes back to life, then David asks him who he is, and he explains that he in fact was a servant to those Amalekites who raided Ziklag. And, he also, I think, gives us a little bit insight into the ethos of the Amalekites.
That they left him.
Yeah. He's sick. Well, he probably won't survive, so why bother feeding him? And they left him by the side of the road. Now, at this point, David does actually, he enlists this Ish Mitzri, this Egyptian man, to take him to see, to find the
raiders,
children, the raiders. Right, exactly. And so it ends up being the way that he finds them, and David finds them, and he battles them, and he rescues them. Okay, so that all of this is, sort of the battle success in the story. But there's a humane element that I think is the critical undercurrent of the story, and I'm going to find it in two more ways that I think are important. Number one is that when David, when they finish the battle and they're on their way back with their wives and children, so these men who had been too weak to go on come to greet David. And in Pasuk Kaf Aleph, we're told, Vaygash David et ha'am. David draws them close, right? There's something about this which is very loving, which is very embracing. Vayish'al lahem l'shalom, which I think is one of the most extraordinary endings of battles that I know of in Tanakh. It's at the end of Pasuk Kaf Aleph, right? He asks after their peace, right? Which, again, if you just look at the bare word shalom, there's that should not be the first word that we say after we finish the battle, except that it is. It should be actually the first word that we say. But again, it's a question of not losing sight of the actual goal. The actual goal of war is not war, it's peace. And the first thing David does when he returns from battle is to ask about peace, right? And there's something about that I think is really critical. It's really critical. I mean, I
these
will
people
say,
who also wanted to kill him, meaning we're talking here about people who earlier, this was a very complex... right? Is it not? We're not thinking it's the related people. Meaning it's the same people. So we have here him going back, getting over the fact that, realizing that they were externalizing their pain on him, and then being able to go back and ask them how they are, meaning bring them these people having committed, the rescue, and then asking how they are. Yeah.
So that definitely is one piece of it. And the other piece of it is just the larger picture, which is that, when we come back from war, we have to make a concerted effort to transition back into peace. It's a piece of the battle that I think, everybody who in this past period,
we are still struggling with
where
the after plan.
No, I'm not. I don't
not
mean
that
just
side.
that. I mean, after 5 months, the first 5 months when all my boys were in battle, and they had to come back to transition back into civilian life. So one of the things that the Army tried to do was to create these kind of, seminars or retreats, these, 3-day retreats where they would kind of unpack what they had experienced, and more importantly, to help these young men who have been battling transition back into their families, back to being husbands, back to being fathers, back to being, friends, back to being in a work environment, in a student life, right? Because the difference between those two situations can be so disconcerting. And so I think this is a piece that we're seeing here as well. And it became clear to me only after these past few years. I kind of reread this parak and I said, wow, that's an extraordinary moment. Vayish'al lahem l'shalom. He said, now we're going into peace. Let's figure out how to do this next this next thing, right? How to get back into a peaceful mode is not something that happens naturally. It needs self-conscious work.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful element here. And I think it also, it leaves space for saying that not everybody is fit to go in, right? These men who weren't coming with him were men who felt that they physically weren't able to continue. And I think that that's also something that we see in the Torah, right? The Torah says, if you're unable, you're scared, you have, a new wife. Not all of these are obviously what exempt you today, but this recognition we have that not everybody is fit for this, and that if they're going to do more damage or do too much damage to themselves, and somehow they have awareness of that before they go out, then maybe this isn't the right choice for them. And I think that that's also a moving piece here. That
is a moving piece here.
Yeah.
I mean, I would even take that one step further, which is not me taking it, but the parak taking it one step further, which is that when they do come back, some of these hardened men who had gone out to battle, and remember, David in general is dealing with a not simple group, right? Because remember, the people who David is basically a fugitive still, right? He's still running away from Shaul, and the people who were attracted to David's environs.
A rough crowd.
It's a rough crowd, right? These are people, a lot of them have outstanding debts, and a lot of them are, petty criminals.
Uncouth.
Yes. And so we see a touch of that both at the beginning of the chapter when they want to stone David, but also here at the end of the chapter when David does kind of embrace these people who were too weak to continue in the battle. So the men who did go to battle say to David, listen, they can have their wives and children back, but they can't share the spoils of war with us. And it also seems to be that they're saying, and we don't want them part of our company anymore. Like they have not proven themselves. They have not been committed. They haven't acted in the way that we needed them to act. And therefore they can take their wives and children, let them go.
Yeah.
And David is so horrified by this, and David's response is so unequivocal. And what we see, the first thing he says is "Lo tasuch ken achai," right? It's a stone-like moment, right? He said, "Don't do this, my brothers." And he says, first of all, God gave us this victory, and also, כחלק היורד במלחמה וכחלק היושב על הכלים יחדיו יחלוקו. We are all one nation. Those who went out to battle and those who were unable to for various reasons, we are sharing in the same destiny. We share the same nationhood. We're all working together. That's what it means to be part of a nation. To be part of a nation means that there will sometimes be, these people who are weak and the strong will have to take care of them. And other times things will shift, right? And so to be part of a nation means that when you come back from battle, you recalibrate and you reconstitute the nation as a nation.
And you also see in this moment that David is guiding what we would call today an ethic of warfare, meaning he's guiding what that looks like. He doesn't have a manual in the way, I'm not sure the manual helps today either, but meaning he doesn't have a clear guideline, and he's almost creating these guidelines. And we know also that some of these customs were not the custom. They were not the prevalent way that people were trying to behave.
So in terms of David writing a manual of war, I think we just learn so much from David. We learn about his leadership. We learn about his relationship with God. We learn about how he deals with a rowdy crowd, right? With difficulty, and difficulty that is genuine. It comes from real anguish. Like we did say that, David has a difficult crowd to deal with, but at the same time, they're right? They're dealing with something that is very real, that is very genuine, that is really filling them with tremendous pain. And David finds the ability to deal with that. But I think that there are really two things or three things that I take out of this story that if I were, writing the David Manual of War, I would put them as, very important parts of that manual. Number one is to hold on to our humanity, right? That even when you have a goal, right, to stop and give water to the person on the side of the road, not even a person who's going to help you necessarily. That's why it was important for me to say that I don't want to be cynical about it, but to really see that there are human beings that, are around and not lose sight of that, especially in a war where a war requires sometimes the taking of life. Yeah. And so it's even more important to hold on to the value of humanity. And the second point is the one about what happens after the war, how we emerge from war with our eye on peace, and to try to leave behind some of the things that we experienced in war, which is not to say that, we don't take it with us on some level, but to try to say, okay, those rules and those things that I was thinking about and those things that were occupying me during war, those aren't the same things that I want to have my focus on now that I am looking towards peace. And the third point, which in my mind is maybe the most important point today, and maybe the most important point in this story as well, is looking for unity. Because just as crisis can pull out the best of people and can pull people together, as we said earlier, it can also sometimes divide. And it can also, lend itself to bringing out some bad sides of people, right? That's very genuine. That's what's happening, here in this story as well. It's a real fear, and people are, can be subject to their own, to their own weaknesses during war. And so what David does in immediately after the war, putting a stop to the divisions and calling them all echai, right? We are all brothers, and actually making it a chok umishpat liYisrael ad hayom hazeh, right? It is a statute and a law in Israel until this day.
He literally wrote the rule book.
Literally, he wrote the rule book. That's exactly what I was going to say. That's the protocols of rule. What did he make a chok hamishpat? It's kind of elliptical what it was, but it's these things, all of these things that we're talking about. It is a chok and a mishpat that when we come, it's a law, it's a statute that when we come back from war, we try to divest ourselves of some of the negative consequences of war, and to use the events that have taken place to build a better society. Maybe I'll just mention one anecdote with regard to unity, that I remember that when my son-in-law did come back from 5 months of reserve duty, and we were talking about some of the divisions in Israel, and he said to me, after spending 5 months really serving shoulder to shoulder with all different types of people, I no longer want to talk about the divisions. I want to talk about what unites us. And it was such a moving moment for me. I've this was already over a year ago, and I've taken it with me ever since. And, we have had our share of, national arguments and divisions. And sometimes I open the newspaper and this protocol of David does not seem to be always implemented. But at the same time, when I think about the next generation, when I think about, the 30-year-olds and that age group, the 20-year-olds to the 30-year-olds who have been serving together, and it gives me a lot of hope. It gives me a lot of hope that even if some of the divisions that are so deeply embedded in society, our age group, our generation, are having a hard time, rising above them. Maybe, perhaps, I hope, the 20 to 30-year-olds who have spent, a year and a half battling together will be able to rise above some of these divisions and to unite together to create a society which is better than the society from, before October 7th.
Dr. Yael Ziegler, thank you for being here. Thank you for bringing us into these battle stories and drawing out the humane. And for me, what is most salient is the power of good leadership, meaning we have here Yonatan as sort of this prototypical soldier who has this heroism that he could take with him and triumph, and David dealing with a complex, human scenario in front of him, being able to have the fortitude of leadership with his strength he takes from his belief, and being able to rein in all of these natural tendencies that people tend to have and tend to express when they're in big groups. I guess I will hope that we feel like we're sending, Yonathans if we have to battle, that we're sending those, and that our leaders, both of them, can display the traits of David. So thank you so much.
Amen. Besarot tovot, we should have Yeshuot and Nechamot, and our soldiers should come back safely, and our Chatufim, the captives, should come back safely, and everybody who needs a healing should find healing.
Thank you.